It could be said that Victorians had a morbid fascination with death. It makes sense as they were surrounded by it. Without modern medicine, the average lifespan was half of what it is today. And hospitals were still disease-infested holes where people were sent to be forgotten. Thus, people died regularly, and they died in the home where everyone could witness each horrific moment. Today, we have removed death from our homes and from our minds in many ways. For the Victorians, death was right in their faces. In 1861, the death of Queen Victoria's beloved husband, Prince Albert, stunned the world. At only 42 years old, Albert had been ill for 2 weeks before finally taking his last breath. His widow would remain on the throne for another 50 years, and his death pushed the Queen into such an intense grief that it changed the course of the world. For the rest of her reign until 1901, England and many other places adopted unusual death and funerary practices, all of which were influenced by Victoria's very public mourning of the late Prince Albert. Thanks to Queen Victoria, grief and mourning became quite fashionable. Standards were also driven by the idea that purgatory was non-existent and the choice for the dying was only between heaven and hell. This change in religious belief gave rise to the concept of lingering death, where the declining person must prepare for the next world. While many didn't fear death, they did fear not being properly mourned. It was an extremely common practice to hold a funeral at home, and it was customary to prepare the home as a death watch, the time between dying and the funeral. The body of the deceased would either be proudly displayed in the parlor or tucked away in their bed to appear as if they were just simply sleeping. Historical evidence would suggest that the Victorians were wary of the dead and relied heavily on superstitious beliefs to shield them from any harm that could potentially be inflicted on them. There was a widely held superstition that mirrors could trap the deceased person, so all the mirrors in the house would be covered in black cloth. Some also argued this helped prevent vanity among the bereaved living in the house. Essentially, the focus would be completely on those who passed, and not those who were still living. Often, family photos and paintings would also be turned upside down or turned to face the wall. Just like the color black, Victorians were also enshrouded in bizarre and superstitious customs. One such tradition even dictated how the deceased were to be removed from the residence. It was believed that if carried out head first, the deceased could see where the house was and return to haunt it. Additionally, the spirit that has not yet been laid to rest would be able to reckon other spirits or lure the living to their own demises. The body was always taken out of the house feet first to prevent it from calling out to others. The strict rules for the mourning process called for the stopping of the clocks at the time of the passing to honor the moment that the soul left this mortal coil. In doing so, the Victorians believed they were averting bad luck. Additionally, they believed this custom allowed the deceased to continue on to the next phase. If the clocks were not stopped, then time would continue, thus allowing the spirits to remain in the present, to haunt, or endless roam in between states of existence. After the deceased would lay to rest, the clock would then be uncovered and restarted. However, if the head of the house had passed, the clock would never tick again. Some believed it was stopped to allow mourning with no time limit. For a reprieve from the city, families in mourning turned to cemeteries to spend their quiet afternoons. Designed like public parks with their Gothic revival mausoleums and Egyptian-inspired colonnades, the cemeteries became a place to spend a Sunday afternoon where families might spread a blanket and a patch of shade and socialize with others who'd come to visit with their loved ones at rest. Of course, this wasn't merely because the Victorians were obsessed with post-life, even if they were. In an overcrowded city like London, cemeteries were clean, comfortable, wide open spaces filled with greenery, so it's easy to see their appeal as recreation areas. The wearing of dark colors, graduating from black to muted colors over time, to reflect a mourning period for a loved one, could last up to 4 years for widows. However, a widow may opt to don black for the remainder of her life. There were also phases of mourning in which the bereaved could begin to introduce some color back into their wardrobes during half mourning. Yet the color of grief affected all aspects of appearance, including caps, umbrellas, and even handkerchiefs. However, due to the high mortality rates and the chance that one person might have multiple deceased relatives, a person might start dark colors for most of their lives. Women were expected to wear black mourning attire for up to 2 years or longer, depending on the relation of the dead. They were expected to isolate themselves and not participate in entertainment or festivities. After a set period of time, they could decrease their mourning by transitioning into shades of purple, gray, and white, and begin to re-enter society. I wonder why black. Maybe because it's so dark. They covered the mirrors in their houses and locked the piano so no music could be played. The doorbell was snuffed out and the doorknobs covered in black crepe. The servants and carriages and pretty much everything would also be draped in the mourning color. These practices were mostly for women, since men needed to continue to do their everyday things because they provided for the household. In addition to the elaborate mourning etiquette, the funerals were elaborate and massive. The larger the funeral, the more that it showed that the family loved the deceased, with many even hiring paid actors to come and mourn. This led Victorians to have heavily attended processions with glass viewing coffins and the intricate headstones and mausoleums that we still see in our cemeteries today. The Victorian Era was also a major time of transition, with new knowledge being discovered in every realm, including evolution and technology, which meant new ideas were challenging religion. Additionally, increased immigration also introduced a variety of new ideas to religion. A lot of people reacted by clinging to old ways and beliefs. Even architecture and furniture reflected this desire to hold on to the past. They exaggerated and dramatized their dedication to their belief in order to not lose them. Tear vials, or lacrimatories, are one of the more over-the-top practices from Victorian mourning traditions. As their name states, they are literally small glass vials with rubber or cork stoppers used for catching the tears of mourners during services of the deceased. During the wake and the funeral, mourners would hold the vials up to their faces in order to catch their tears. After their service, these vials would be presented to the family of the deceased as a way to prove how much that the person would be missed. Tear vials were also really handy in helping a mourning family decide how long an appropriate mourning period should be. Once the tears in the vials were all dried up, mourning could cease. On the 7th of May of 1821, 2 doctors were engrossed in a frantic search. There was a decomposing body at stake, and if they didn't find some plaster soon, its features would be lost forever. Mere hours earlier, the French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte had succumbed to a brief illness after 6 years in exile. Those in attendance were keen to create a death mask, an impression of the face usually taken soon after the person had died. But there were 2 small glitches in the plan. Firstly, the hunt was unfolding on the tropical island of St. Helena, a barren speck in the South Atlantic, 807 miles from any other land. There were no shops on this miserable and dreary rock, as Napoleon described it, that could supply highly specialist product, such as plaster. Secondly, neither of the doctors present had ever made a death mask before. The history of death masks stretched back millennia, deep into antiquity. Most of them were not exact replicas taken from molds, but artworks created for elite members of society, protective armor that could help the deceased to navigate the afterlife or ward off evil spirits. By the late Middle Ages, Europe had become obsessed with death after the plague wiped out about 50% of the population in just 4 traumatic years. It was at this moment that true death masks superseded the sculpted, artistic kind. These likenesses, created by molding wax or plaster over the face, were a useful way of fossilizing the features of deceased relatives so that sculptors could use them as a reference for the lifelike portraits displayed at funerals. Then, in the 18th century, something unexpected happened. People began to value death masks for their own sake. For the next 200 years, doctors across Europe set about assiduously preserving these glimpses of the moments after death for posterity. Faces of icons, criminals, and even babies were immortalized in grisly detail. Practice that coincided with a surge of interest in the pseudoscience phrenology, in which a person's personality traits were inferred from the features of their skull. Many death masks were turned into spooky heirlooms, while some became souvenirs that command 6-figure sums to this day. One was revered as an object of beauty comparable to the Mona Lisa, inspiring countless artworks and wild theories. In the late 1880s, the body of a young woman thought to have drowned was found floating in the Seine River in Paris. The corpse was taken to the local morgue, which was a popular attraction at the time, and put on display in case anyone could identify the person that it belonged to. Instead, in an uncomfortable development to a story that has been since acknowledged as deeply creepy, the pathologist on duty became so taken with the young woman's beauty and innocence that he had a death mask made before she was buried. The cast from The Unknown Woman of the Scene, in which the woman seems to be smiling contently with her lips pursed, was subsequently turned into a popular artwork. The work inspired sculptors, writers, and painters, and was displayed on the walls of houses of ordinary people, until one day, over half a century after its unknown subject died, a Norwegian toy manufacturer decided to use the face for a lifelike recitation doll that he was working on. Ceci Annie, sometimes known as Rescue Annie, was born, and it's been estimated that the CPR courses that she helped with have saved some 2.5 million people from cardiac arrest. With changing attitudes to death and the growing popularity of photography in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the practice of making death masks gradually fell out of fashion. People just didn't need them anymore when they could just look at a photo of their lost loved ones instead. I myself would want a mask of my loved one when they were alive. But everybody's different. Times are different. Today, the practice of making death masks have largely disappeared, but some artists are still keeping it alive through their own modern interpretations. Death masks show the subject's facial expression immediately after death. It was important to make death masks quickly before the features lost muscle control and became distorted. Death masks were used for a number of reasons: as a tool for sculpture or effigy making, or as objects of veneration. When it came to memorializing the dead, the Victorians were not afraid to do things that would be considered a little unconventional by today's standards. Commemorating the dead was so popular during the Victorian era, in fact, that portions of the deceased's hair would be clipped off and turned into brooches, lockets, wreaths, and much more. If a family wasn't particularly crafty or were too sad to create these things themselves, they could send the hair off to an artisan who could do it for them. And in the end, Human hair brooches aren't really that strange, considering this was a society that made fans out of preserved birds and contorted taxidermied cats into human poses for photography, unwrapped mummies for fun, and made public visits to the morgue. In some cases, hair was used as an adornment on a photograph of the departed. Memento mori, meaning remember that you have to die, were personal mementos and symbols of the deceased, such as masks, paintings, sculptures, and jewelry, meant to remind the mourner of the deceased and their own mortality. Hair of the deceased would be worked into shadow boxes, wreaths, corsages, fabrics, paintings, and jewelry to be worn by the mourner. Furthermore, jewelry played a key role in worshiping the dead. Hair, bones, and teeth of the deceased were coveted by the living and were frequently turned into items of jewelry. These mementos were accepted graciously by the Victorians, and in contrast to the way today's society would view them, the Victorians found the brooches, necklaces, rings, etc. as a respected ritual worth pursuing. To proudly wear something that today would be considered morally wrong suggests that the Victorian era were not only obsessed with worshipping the dead, but were quite possibly the most respectful mourners of all time. Victorians often wore mourning jewelry to keep a piece of their loved ones close after death. Scattered across American cemeteries are a handful of fascinating, poignant, and unusual graves, commemorating the short lives of little girls whose parents wanted to memorialize them a little more unusually in death. While there are several across America, I wanted to present a few fascinating and truly curious examples. In Oakwood Cemetery, Atlanta, Alabama, the grave of 5-year-old Nadine Earls is marked by a substantial brick dollhouse, realistically the size of a Wendy's house or a playhouse, that could function as a scaled-down replica of a modest tweed bungalow. Complete with awnings, a postbox, and flower boxes, the little house is maintained by the city, who add lights and wreaths to the grave in the winter and keep the house looking its best. Nadine Earls died the week before Christmas in 1933. Asked her father for a dollhouse for Christmas, but she died before it was ever completed. In its place, her parents decided that the little girl would still get her dollhouse and installed it after her burial. The original dollhouse rotted over time and was replaced by a brick likeness to ensure its longevity. Nadine's parents maintained the grave themselves for years after her death, looking after the structure and keeping the little shack stacked with new toys, including a host of toy dolls and playthings. Curiously, inside the house, what appears to be a toy bed is, in fact, her headstone. Nadine's little house continues to sit in the family plot, where her parents, Jillian and Alma, now reside beside her. Dorothy Harvey is buried in Medina, Tennessee, but she was never a resident. As her family traveled upstate to find work in 1926, 5-year-old Dorothy became ill and died of measles, leaving the family with little choice but to bury her in an unfamiliar town and move on with their journey. To support the poor and grieving family, the townsfolk banded together and had the young child buried with a headstone and eventually a small dollhouse to keep her company. Sadly, as with so many unusual memorials, the original house was destroyed by vandals many years ago, with a few pictures remaining of its original incarnation. However, since its destruction, a larger house has been installed over the grave and is still in situ. Occasionally, passing mourners and tourists leave gifts of toys and dolls by her grave, and the local legend persists that on some days, if you peek through the window of her house, you can see little Dorothy herself. Much like the tragic tale of Nadine Earls, 6-year-old Vivian May had been hoping for a dollhouse for Christmas, but died just short of a day itself. After building the house, it was installed over her grave in Connersville, Indiana, where her father kept it fully stocked with personal trinkets and toys in her memory. After years of upkeep by her parents and sister, the grave eventually fell into serious disrepair, with vandals almost succeeding in ripping it from the gravesite. Thankfully, as with so many of these graves, the local community rallied around and preserved Vivian's house, seeing her as a beloved resident and not just as a local curiosity. The group of volunteers fully refurbished the house, but also laid new foundations and immovable concreted bolts, making any future vandalism attempts futile. 25 miles away from Vivian, a similar dollhouse grave can be found in Arlington, Indiana. Lova Klein had a tragic and short life. Born with an unknown neurological illness, she was unable to move unassisted and had few pleasures in life, save for the dollhouse made by her father and filled with toys by her mother. The house itself was enormous, being 5 foot tall, with large viewing windows, so the small girl could gaze inside even if she couldn't actively play with the toys herself. After her death in 1908, the house was moved to Lova's grave, so she could always enjoy her favorite toy. Here it remained until the death of her mother, at the event which her father asked that it be destroyed. Unwilling to damage the child's memorial, the cemetery caretaker disinterred the child and moved her remains and house beside her mother, who had been buried in a different cemetery. So many of these beautiful graves have suffered extreme vandalism over the years. But their constant restoration is a credit to cemetery volunteers who, in doing so, preserve an unsung American funerary and mourning tradition. Dollhouse graves pique our interest in varying ways, not least as a curiosity. After all, how many of us have seen these tiny houses and places of burial? They are also incredibly emotional sites, being a lasting memorial not just to the child, but to the extreme outpouring of grief from the parents. These little houses become representative of a universal every daughter, a child in their playroom for all eternity.